Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Mia Tamburi, the Program Director of Cancer Bridges and a member of the Education and Outreach Work Group for Cancer and the Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania. Today's presentation is Train Safety, Rail Proliferation and its Negative Impacts on Cancer and Health. This speaker series is a project of the Education and Outreach Work Group for Cancer and the Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania, which is a network of organizations and individuals who are concerned about environmental chemicals and how they're contributing to our region's high rates of cancer. Cancer Bridges is co-sponsoring today's webinar. At Cancer Bridges, we provide support for those impacted by cancer, including counseling, support groups, health and wellness classes, family and youth activities, and much more. Both organizations' websites can be found in the chat. If you happen to get disconnected, please log back into the webinar. And if you need technical assistance, please send a message via the chat box to Andre Green. His name is listed below in the chat. Also, please enter your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on both Cancer Bridges and SenSpa's website. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Glenn Olshurst and Barbara Tellerico. Glenn and Barbara are the co-founders of Rail Pollution Protection Pittsburgh. Barb will be interviewing Glenn today for our presentation. Glenn is RP3's general counsel. For over a decade, Barbara and Glenn and RP3 have countered industrial rail expansion in the Pittsburgh's region, which is among the most intensely used corridors for transport of hazardous chemicals and volatile oil in North America. RP3's tactics include grassroots campaigns, administrative litigation, injunctions, and court-ordered mediation, which resulted in a 4-year delay of Norfolk Southern's vertical clearance project. Significant monetary settlements were extracted from the railroad, which helped mitigate the negative impact of the project on environmental justice area neighborhoods. Glenn's specialty relates to rail safety failure points and state and federal policy reform and action items, including in-depth knowledge of Norfolk Southern, the company responsible for the East Palestine derailment. Thank you, Glenn and Barbara, for being with us today.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
So I'll start off. Glenn, would you like to just tell everybody about Rail Pollution Protection's mission?
RP3's mission is to counteract the risk and impacts that expanding rail transport and related facilities have on adjacent communities in terms of health, safety, and air and water quality. Barbara and I started our campaign against Norfolk Southern in 2011 to try and save 3 century-old trees in our historic park. After I retired in 2018, together we formed RP3 after gaining a better understanding that this railroad was threatening more than just our trees. And incidentally, those trees are still standing.
What can you tell us about rail pollution and its impact on health and air and water quality?
Well, Cancer and the Environment Network imagines a reduction of fossil fuels because oil, gas, and coal directly impact health, create air and water pollution, and accelerate climate change. Well, locomotive engines emit some of the worst of those pollutions, and they function as a mobile pipeline to boot. Consider that rail lines were built to make deliveries to the largest sources of stationary pollution, such as steel mills and ethane cracker plants. Those stationary sources are not located in wealthy neighborhoods. In Pittsburgh, a full 76% of those in the 1-mile derailment blast zone and the diesel locomotive pollution fallout zone live in environmental justice areas because of redlining. That is true throughout our nation, where 25 million people live within a 1-mile blast zone, and 60% are in environmental justice communities. Well, at the moment, everyone is focused on derailments, but according to Carnegie Mellon University analysts, train pollution is 3 times worse in terms of health impact because it is constant. Those risks escape policymakers' attention because they are not sensational. Diesel engine trains emit a variety of air pollutants known to adversely affect human health, including volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. Black carbon locomotive diesel emissions are proven to cause higher rates of asthma, decreased lung function in children, cancer, and premature death from heart or lung disease. Diesel particulate matter happens to be the largest single air pollutant driving cancer risk in Allegheny County. Slide 1, please. University of Pittsburgh analysts working in the School of Public Health, Center for Healthy Environments and Communities conservatively determined that in terms of air pollution, a volume of 100 trains per day at their current length and weight is equivalent to a minimum of 6,800 diesel buses driving past your doorstep every day. Just think about that. And on days when there are inversions, the impact's much worse. Longer, heavier trains would multiply the diesel bus number exponentially. Train length throughout the nation is actually doubling as we speak. CMU researchers determined that with every 10 trains per day, there will be 6 air pollution related deaths per year. Pennsylvania alone has hundreds of thousands of trains traveling on its rails each year. But even more disturbing is CMU's conclusion that for every 1 hour of train idling, that will equal 1 pollution-related death per year. And trains have been observed idling in densely populated communities for many hours at a time. What you need to do looking forward is understand that idling will increase by major magnitudes as rail volume increases, since lower priority trains will be sidelined all throughout southwestern Pennsylvania to allow higher priority double stacks to pass. So in light of these facts, I suggest that you think of rail pollution as a slow motion train derailment. Now, that's what I call a crude awakening. And water pollution happens when the pollution in the air settles and is exacerbated when there is a derailment. And we'll cover that in a bit.
So can you imagine any solutions?
There are solutions. A Tier 4 compliant locomotive engine significantly reduces both oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter by between 86 and 90%, depending on which study you look at. According to the Diesel Technology Forum, quote, the emission reductions from replacing just one of the oldest locomotive engines removes 37,602 pounds of nitrogen oxide a year and is equivalent to replacing 29 older trucks or removing 30,000 cars from the road each year. A nationwide campaign in each state would educate elected officials about how to access federal and state diesel emissions reduction funding. Potential sources for federal and state grants for this purpose are the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Fund and the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act. In addition, every state's share of the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust Fund is available for building cleaner switchyard locomotives. We'll actually revisit this issue when we get to action items.
So as we all witnessed in East Palestine, derailments create additional air and water pollution. Help us understand rail safety failure points that increase the risk of an epic derailment.
Well, first, you may have heard about the business model adopted by all of the Class 1 rail lines called Precision Scheduled Railroading, or PSR. It's premised on a 30 to 40% cut in staff, and that includes engineers, maintenance, and inspectors. It's premised on rail yards mixing whatever rail cars are available together into the same even longer train, and most importantly, on making strict on-time departures and arrival. Now, in terms of the arrival, Norfolk Southern has a written rule that managers can disregard safety alarms and tell a train to continue or maybe just slow down. A derailment of a Norfolk Southern coal train occurred this past weekend because of this policy again being exercised. Now, ProPublica asked the other 6 Class 1 rail lines if they had a similar policy. 4 said no. One of the 4 said one could or should never disregard a stop the train alarm, and 2 did not respond. Well, this business model accounts for a trickle-down series of risks for everyone. But it gives Norfolk Southern, as one example, the ability to make $13 billion in stock buybacks, to award record bonuses to its executives, and to make record profits for the corporation. This business model was implemented after rail lobbyists secured the elimination of several safety regulations from the previous administrations and substituted the promise. They promised that the rail operators would responsibly self-regulate. As it turns out, turning over regulatory authority to industries whose executives earn their bonuses on profits was never a good idea for either the public or for the environment. Consider the Volkswagen diesel emissions fraud. Consider the Boeing 737 MAX debacle. So in our case, corporate greed and regulatory failure have once again put the public at risk. Now, allowing a railroad to self-regulate is much worse. Since when a railroad cuts corners, the consequences are catastrophic for entire communities for multiple decades into the future. The problem here is that while Norfolk Southern touts safety, behind closed doors, they appear to be promoting profits over prudence. We know this because of what was said in a complaint that was filed in U.S. District Court for Western Pennsylvania. The Federal Labor Standards Act whistleblower lawsuit was filed on behalf of Mr. Russell Puzowski, a Norfolk Southern locomotive engineer for 21 years, working out of the company's Conway rail yard in Beaver County. I'm going to read you some excerpts from the complaint in that case. Complaint paragraphs 10 through 13 state that during a 3-month period, Engineer Pazowski discovered 40 federal safety rule violations that either, quote, took these trains out of service or delayed their departure while additional inspections or repairs were performed. Pazowski believed that, quote, these safety violations were especially significant because of onboard hazardous materials, unquote. Paragraph 14 through 18 state that Engineer Pazowski was told that the local management team could, quote, no longer tolerate the delays caused by his reporting of non-compliant locomotives because it was causing them to get their asses chewed out by their superiors, unquote. According to paragraph 37, Pazowski, quote, had previously been told that on-time departure was more important than adequate pre-departure inspection. Now, what we all need to understand is that reporting of unsafe locomotive conditions and refusal to operate a locomotive that had not been inspected is required by federal law. And this case is important because it calls into question whether there's a system-wide top-down pressure on engineers to shortcut inspections. Note also the headline for a recent article in The Guardian, which touts, quote, leaked audio reveals U.S. rail workers told to skip inspections, unquote. So what I'm sharing with you is a national problem. In East Palestine, Ohio, is a huge fiery alarm bell because that train would have never derailed if it had been properly inspected before it left the yard. Wheel bearings that are at the end of their life visibly leak oil. And that would have been seen if inspectors were given enough time to inspect. As if all that's not enough, in May of 2018, Norfolk Southern's lawyers admitted in a complaint filed in federal court in their own lawsuit against rail tie manufacturer Boatwright Rail Products that Norfolk Southern has installed 5 million defective rail ties throughout their system, supplied by Boatwright, that in their own words are, quote, inherently dangerous because they were not waterproofed, are prone to more quickly rot, and which cannot be easily identified or found because Boatwright failed to include identifying kerf marks. All of this means that you can no longer think of trains running through your towns with nostalgia. This is definitely not a good neighbor. Rather, this is a Norfolk nightmare coming soon to a neighborhood near you.
So we're looking at the slide that lists additional rail safety failure points. Can you take us through the rest of the ones on this slide, Glenn?
Slide 2, 1 through 6, I'll do them by number. There are 6 other rail safety points that make a derailment a potential city killer. Human error accounts for the most derailments, and that results from excessive train speed and manual switches being set incorrectly, as we all recently saw in the head-on collision in Greece. The solution is to slow trains carrying hazardous material below the 40-mile-per-hour limit currently allowed in urban areas, and to implement positive train control with backup systems on all lines carrying hazardous material under an expanded definition of what is hazardous. Number two, substandard infrastructure. Well, rail bridges are the most vulnerable point in any rail line. Poorly rated, privately owned rail bridges are most likely to collapse because they have gone the longest without being painted or maintained. They carry the heaviest loads, coal car trains, of any type of bridge, and their failure resulting in the derailment of an oil train would cause the largest catastrophe in terms of risk of death and damage. Now, underrated rail bridges should be given priority for maintenance over vehicular bridges, because if the poor condition of the rails, even the rails atop the bridge, crack, it'll cause an exploding derailment and bring down both the bridge and the train. So pressure from press and our elected officials will be necessary to enable independent engineers to review the inspection reports and categorize the priority of necessary repairs. Consider that there's currently no national inventory of rail bridges, no mandated submission of inspection records, and no required minimum engineering standard for rail bridges. The federal government has ceded authority for rail inspection and oversight to the railroads that own approximately 100,000 rail bridges around the nation. Okay, number three, rail companies are allowed to self-regulate and are left to determine safe load limits, rail track and train wheel wear standards, inspection and maintenance schedules, and engineering standards with little or no independent oversight. In addition, federal guidelines provide no minimum design standards for bridge construction or maintenance. Number four, substandard below rail infrastructure. Well, many water and sewer lines, I'm talking 4 and 6 foot diameter beneath the rail tracks, all along Norfolk Southern's Pittsburgh line, are over 100 years old. They're made of hand-laid brick whose mortar has been degraded from acid rain, and they're at their end of the useful life. They need to be inspected, replaced, or reinforced before train volume increases, and Pittsburgh is not unique in this regard. 5, Bakken crude is volatile because the gases it contains. That's why it's explosive. It's not the oil, it's the gases. And according to the Wall Street Journal, just one rail car is the equivalent, get this, of 2 million sticks of dynamite. And we have unit trains that are 100 plus cars long. Now, railroads save money by shipping the oil and gases together. And 40 to 50% of all of the explosive oil processed in our East Coast refineries comes through Pittsburgh. That's an astounding figure. That's 2.1 billion gallons of explosive oil on our tracks and across Pennsylvania. The solution is easy. It's been around for decades. Stabilize the oil by removing the volatile gases before it's loaded onto the rail cars. But that interferes with railroads' profits. So we all bear the risk. 6, railroads have control over how much or how little to fill a tank car. They want to fill them as much as possible, even to unsafe limits, because that increases their profits, but that can cause a derailment. And it's necessary to implement and enforce standards against both overloading and underloading, which will prevent sloshing if it's underloaded and cause a derailment. And that's what's necessary to reduce that likelihood.
So back in 2015, the Heinz Endowments sponsored a 3-day oil train conference. And the collective view of our city, county, and state elected officials and emergency responders, the emergency responders, was we will take care of a derailment after it happens. What's your view of their response to handling a catastrophic derailment?
Slide 3, please. Take a moment and do a close look at the bottom of that picture. There is a train at the very bottom of that image. And what you see is the explosion of just one rail car of propane. Some unit trains have dozens of propane and ethane rail cars. Luckily, this derailment happened 7 miles out of town in a rural area. So emergency response is a fiction, and our elected officials need to understand that. We all witnessed the shit show after the East Palestine derailment. We must focus on prevention. The government is pretending that they are prepared, and first responders are in peril because they don't know the volatility levels of the different gases that are in the rail cars. It is simply irresponsible to pretend that the risk can be managed. Railroads have offloaded emergency response capabilities to local communities that in reality are not funded or prepared for this type of catastrophe. Which is why I say the regulatory system is broken. Authority has been ceded to the monopoly. No laws have been broken, and that's the problem.
So Glenn, is there anything about the East Palestine derailment that leads you to believe that Norfolk Southern cannot be trusted and must be regulated?
Remember that promise I mentioned to self-regulate responsibly? Well, what we got was the East Palestine derailment, resulting in the, as it now turns out, apparently unnecessary release and burn of 115,580 gallons of highly toxic, flammable chloride, vinyl chloride. Now, I say that because 2 days of National Transportation Safety Board hearings revealed that the manufacturer of that vinyl chloride had stabilized the chlorine mixture by removing the oxygen before it was loaded into the rail cars so that it would not explode. They had shared that information with both Norfolk Southern and their consultants before the decision to release and burn was made. Here's the kicker. Norfolk Southern withheld that information from the Unified Emergency Response Command and from the governor of Ohio. So according to the testimony, Keith Drabick, who is the chief of East Palestine's volunteer fire department, which is made up of 38 members, made the final decision to vent and burn those chemicals. According to volunteer fire chief Drabick, he was told by Norfolk Southern's consultant, get this, that he had 13 minutes to make a decision of whether or not we were going to vent or burn because they were running out of daylight. He testified that, quote, Norfolk Southern never told him that the manufacturer, whose name is Oxyvinyls, had advised that it didn't believe polymerization was or could be occurring. Now, remember that Norfolk Southern originally justified the burn to the press and to the community because of what it claimed were rising temperatures in one vinyl chloride car. Instead of just venting and burning that one car, remember they burned all 5 cars carrying vinyl chloride. So at the hearing, the NTSB presented a graph that showed the temperatures in that vinyl chloride tanker car that Norfolk Southern claimed was its concern was on a downward trend before the chemical release and burn. It is now also clear that Norfolk Southern withheld other key information from first responders on what chemicals the cars contained for many hours. Yet, in the first 10 minutes after the derailment, Norfolk Southern sent its contractor, consulting firm CTEH, the same information through a document known as a train, quote, a train consist, unquote. Eric Brewer, Beaver County's emergency management coordinator, testified at the NTSB hearing that, quote, it wasn't until late that night or the next morning that I did learn by myself what was contained in those cars. Personally, I did not know that there were any hazardous material chemicals, unquote. Realizing that Norfolk Southern is the best of all Class 1 railroads, there can be no better proof that Norfolk Southern is unworthy of the public's trust and needs to again be strictly regulated, along with the rest of all of the rail operators. Now, RP3 will be sending its members a more detailed email blast expose on the East Palestine derailment next week. This derailment was not an accident. It was negligence and entirely avoidable. I think CENSWPA will be posting a link to our East Palestine derailment email expose on their website as soon as it's available, so you can catch it there. It'll also be on our website, and we'll have a link to our website at the end.
So what's the current state of our national rail infrastructure and the magnitude of the risk related to a catastrophic derailment?
I'd say that we have a national problem akin to a lit bomb, but no one knows exactly the length of the fuse. As I mentioned, bridges are the most vulnerable point in any rail system. But if you look, you will see for yourselves that these rail bridges are not painted, have missing bolts and cross ties that are so entirely corroded that they no longer even touch. And unless these bridges were built recently, they're not Core 10 weathering steel, but raw steel, purposefully left exposed to the elements for decades. Now, the explanation for the poor condition of rail bridges is the, quote, zero bridge maintenance business model, unquote. Let me explain the way this works. The railroad's own engineers will alert the state when their bridge is maybe 4 years away from total failure, declare an emergency, and get tax dollars to help replace it because of the extreme safety risk. In Pennsylvania, that takes the form of an RTAP grant. And the best example is the Merchant Street Bridge leading to the Clark Bar building on the north side. That bridge was neither raised nor lowered, but replaced brand spanking new at a 70% discount on an expedited basis. So what I'm trying to tell you is there is no incentive to maintain privately owned rail bridges when they know they can get a new one at a significant discount. So your question was magnitude of risk. We need to take into consideration derailments and water pollution. Rail contamination of rivers happens more often than you may realize. In a recent report published by the Pittsburgh Collaboratory for Water Research, Education, and Outreach, University of Pittsburgh researchers discovered that most train derailments in our region occur near major rivers. Data gathered by the Federal Railroad Administration between 2011 and 2022 showed that 211 of the 270 accidents occurred within 300 yards of a major river. Take our own most recent Harmer derailment example. That derailment came much closer to taking out all of Pittsburgh's entire drinking water supply than you were told. We need to also consider, in terms of magnitude of risk, that chlorine gas is regularly transported through Pittsburgh. Each rail car contains 180,000 gallons of deadly chlorine gas under pressure. Any puncture will release that heavier than air cloud, suffocating all in its path within 10 minutes. You cannot evacuate Pittsburgh in 10 minutes. Liquid natural gas, LNG by rail, was never allowed until permits were granted by the last administration. I'm here to say that this is in our future, given that there are 15 processing terminals being built on the East and Gulf Coast to help Europe and Asia with their energy needs. And whether that happens will depend on the next election. Transporting LNG by rail is the only feasible way to feed those plants. But 22 tank cars of LNG have the equivalent explosive force of the Hiroshima atom bomb. So what's the state of our national rail system? We have 3 derailments every day in the United States, and that is unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. So the short answer to your question is that the US rail system is third world. It's actually at the bottom of third world rankings, literally.
What about climate change? What can you tell us about its impact on the national rail system?
Slide 4, please. As far as railroads go, climate change impacts are here now. Really, in terms of more intense heat, cold, record rainfalls, and flooding. We've all seen that this week. This issue is what sustainable designers call a, quote, wicked problem. So, slide 4, what you're seeing are pictures of sun kinks, otherwise known as spaghetti rails. So let's take heat first in that litany of existing climate change. As temperatures rise, tracks will expand and get longer and then buckle. And you get what you see on the screen. Sun King spaghetti rails, cute name, but the result is a derailment. According to published reports in 2020, Sun Kings have caused more than 2,100 derailments in the last 40 years in the United States, and this is going to get much, much, much worse. So when we're talking about temperatures, what do we mean? Ambient air temperatures over 90 degrees, and the recommendation for railroads is to slow down, way down. Now, remember precision scheduled railroading, and that UPS is actually Norfolk Southern's biggest customer. So there's not going to be a whole lot of slowing down. Now, added to the ambient air temperature, rails in direct sunlight are 40 to 68 degrees hotter than the air temperature. Now, add to both of those the heat caused by the friction generated by the speed of the train. All right, so how is this handled? To diminish buckling, steel rails are stretched to make them longer, but there is a limit. And temperatures over 110 degrees are outside the limit and the top range for welding, expansion, and stretching. Now, everything that I just shared with you happens the same way to the steel on rail bridges. Recognize that most rail bridges in this country, especially in Pennsylvania, are well over 100 years old. Now, there are complex computerized mathematical formulas in use today that were not in use when these bridges were built. And the climate has changed besides. Most rail structure was built using early 20th century temperature records. So what's been going on? There was an intense heat event in the United Kingdom in 2022. What did they do? They wrapped their older bridges in silver insulation. They painted their rails with an ultra reflective white paint. And then they halted all train traffic entirely. That's not going to happen here. We're just going to have more and more serious derailments. This week, the New York Times featured an article on underground climate change. From the increased heat right now under Chicago's buildings and rail infrastructure, causing the ground to shift in ways that are most troubling now and that are going to get much worse. All right, done with heat, let's move to cold. That's simple. A stretched rail will crack in extreme cold. Moving to wet, rain and floods. All throughout the rail systems in Pennsylvania and all over the nation are antiquated water drainage systems. They are overwhelmed by record rainfall or flooding. Now, what that does is it supersaturates the soil under the ballast. And this is actually a scientific term. It's called, quote, puddling, unquote. And it results in a shift which take the rails out of alignment. So what I'm telling you is that we're not going to build our way out of this. We must decarbonize. Because if you really think about it, climate change is a weapon of mass destruction.
So that was a lot of information, and I'm sure people are wondering, what can they do to fight these conditions? Are there any immediate action items people can take?
Yes, we do have action items. Slide 5, please. So taking these by number 1, should know that we have no problems with trains generally. We are proposing that our elected, representatives help provide Norfolk Southern with geographically unrestricted state and federal diesel emissions reduction funding. This is a win-win since Pennsylvania gets more manufacturing, workers get higher paying, family supporting jobs with benefits at Norfolk Southern's Altoona, Pennsylvania plant, which incidentally has sustained massive layoffs since 2019. And we all get cleaner air. That's a bipartisan issue. The same applies to the Wabtec plant in Erie, which is capable of building 1,000 Tier 4 engines a year. Number 2, the Railway Safety Act is going to the full Senate. We'll put a link in the chat to demand that DOT 111 rail cars, which carry hazardous chemicals and ethanol and are unsafe at any speed, be removed from the rail system by 2025 as originally proposed, rather than in 2028 as recently amended. And that additional loopholes in that bill be closed. We don't want these unsafe at any speed, prone to puncture rail cars traveling adjacent to higher center of gravity, less stable double stacked cars through Pittsburgh and across the rest of Pennsylvania. Number 3, finally, we are enclosing a link to federal and state action items that are not preempted, listing policy reforms that need to be implemented to improve rail safety and emergency response overall. This is important because the Ohio legislature passed a law limiting, requiring that the trains have at least two folks on board. And Norfolk Southern is suing the state, saying that's preempted. So here's a list of what other high density rail car states have enacted themselves. It's all been tested, and none of it's preempted, and Pennsylvania can do it right now, and so can Ohio. And we'll have links for 1 through 3 in the chat.
Yeah, I just put them in there, Glenn.
Okay.
So Anything else you want to add in closing?
Yeah. Give me a microphone and I'll add something. In closing, consider that each passing train, with each passing train, the rail operators are playing Russian roulette with you. They're spinning the cylinder and we are literally dodging bullets. I have known for sure, and now everyone knows, that Norfolk Southern's complete arrogance and disregard for the health and safety of people is what drives our grassroots campaign. RP3 encourages communities to use their voice to contact federal and state officials. The more of this that happens at every level, the more difficult it will be for elected leaders to serve polluters instead of their constituents. We will put a link in the chat for you to RP3's website and sign up for future rail policy reform, safety and health information. If there's one thing that I've learned in my old age, is that you cannot underestimate the power of what a community can do when they stand together, as we've seen in East Palestine. We all deserve power without pollution and energy without injustice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Glenn and Barbara. We have some questions and we have a few minutes, so I'm just going to jump into them. Has RP3 made connections with any railroad workers unions about these issues? Regulation and enforcement are clearly necessary, and higher safety and working standards have been advocated for by railroad workers unions.
Yes, in connection with the Railway Safety Act, numerous unions have weighed in, and we've been contacting different whistleblowers besides. So let's see. The Bipartisan Rail Safety Act, as it stands right now, would strengthen rail cars and railway detection and inspection requirements. They require rail carriers to provide advance notice to state emergency response officials and authorize $22 million in Federal Rail Administration and $5 million for research to develop stronger tank cars and increase fines. But it stops short of dictating major regulatory changes, leaving the matter to the Federal Rail Administration and the Transportation Safety Department. And the unions have had a lot to say about what's missing.
Okay, next question is it true that NNS brakes have never been replaced since the 1800s? If so, how does this factor into the already poor safety regulations or lack thereof?
Oh, it's big time. It's one of the critical recommendations that we make. Right now, all the trains in the country are using Civil War era air brake technology. Now, let me explain what that means. The engineer wants to stop the train. He pulls the brake lever and air pressure goes from one car back to the car behind it to put on the brakes all the way down one car at a time. And so as we saw in East Palestine, while the front of the train was braked, the back of the train was unbraked. And they had loaded heavier rail cars in the back and empty rail cars in the middle. And that's what causes a catastrophic derailment. And electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, ECP brakes, are available. The last administration deleted the requirement that they be implemented. And they put the brakes on at the speed of light. So it's even more important when you look at Pittsburgh, because these trains are coming through the Pittsburgh line, which is 14 different, almost 90-degree turns within 27 miles. 3 of them are within 1.5 miles of each other. And the most dangerous part of running a train is when it starts and stops. And so we have 2- and 3-mile trains that are stopped right by Nova Place and are still on the Fort Pitt Bridge over to the convention center and into the Strip in Lawrenceville. And if the engineer wants to start the train and move through the north side, releases the brake, and steps on the gas too soon, the front of the train is moving, the back of the train is still locked, and the locomotive will pull the train off the bridge. So the technology exists. It'll stop trains 40 to 60% faster, and our elected representatives need to make that happen because the railroads are making record profits and $13 billion stock buybacks. They have the money to do this right and keep us safe.
Okay. Debbie, I apologize because she put her question at 12:45, so I'm not exactly sure about this one. Maybe you can chime in, Debbie, but she said, how have Amtrak and other passenger rails responded to this? So I'm not sure what the exact this is, but she does say, I have Amtrak tickets from NYC to Philly in 2 weeks. Would you ride?
The Amtrak rail lines are given extra inspection. So they're in better shape than most. And in addition, the infrastructure bill has a couple of $100 million available for lines that carry Amtrak trains. There are 11 projects throughout the nation that are earmarked for that, but none of them in Pennsylvania at the moment. So our elected officials should work on that. But go ahead and take your ride.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's 1:02. Thank you for answering those questions, Glenn. I wanted to mention that on August 3rd from 12 to 5, SenSpa will be co-sponsoring a half-day symposium with Cancer-Free Economy Network called 6 Months After the Train Derailment. There'll be more information to follow on that. If you'd like more information about how to get involved in Cancer and the Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania, please visit their website at senspod.org. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Barbara and Glenn. That was a lot of great information. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
that concludes
you.
today's webinar.
Thank you.
Yeah.